There is a specific moment, probably more common than anyone admits, when you catch yourself doing it, muttering under your breath while searching for lost keys, narrating your own actions while cooking dinner, arguing silently, or not so silently, with a version of yourself in the shower. And there's a flicker of embarrassment that follows, a quick glance around to make sure no one heard, as if you've been caught doing something faintly unstable. But what if the voice in your head, and sometimes escaping your mouth, isn't a glitch in an otherwise silent mind? What if it's one of the most sophisticated psychological tools you possess, and the people who use it well are quietly outperforming the people who don't, in ways that have almost nothing to do with willpower or intelligence? The common assumption is that talking to yourself is, at best, a harmless quirk, and at worst, a subtle sign that something isn't quite right. We associate it with isolation, with the eccentric muttering to themselves on a park bench, with the unraveling mind in every film that wants to signal a character's decline. Silence, in our cultural imagination, is the sound of a healthy, together mind. Self-talk is the sound of one starting to come apart. But look closer at the actual research, and the story reverses almost entirely. Psychologists distinguish between two very different kinds of inner dialogue, and the difference between them changes everything about whether self-talk helps or harms you. The first is what's called first-person self-talk, the instinctive, panicked "I can't do this. I'm going to fail. Why do I always mess this up?" The second is second or third-person self-talk, addressing yourself the way you'd address someone else, by name or with you. "You've got this. You've done harder things than this before." The psychologist Ethan Kross, who has spent much of his career studying what he calls chatter, the loop of anxious, self-referential thought that spirals when things go wrong, discovered something that seems almost too simple to be true. Merely shifting from I to you when talking to yourself under stress measurably changes performance, confidence, and even physiological stress markers. People who silently coach themselves through a difficult task using their own name, "Sarah, you can handle this," performed better and reported significantly less anxiety than people using I. The content of the advice was often identical. The distance created by the pronoun was what mattered. This single finding unravels a much bigger illusion. The illusion that the self is one unified voice, speaking in a single register from a single vantage point. It isn't. The mind seems to contain multiple positions from which it can address itself, and switching between them isn't a sign of instability. It's closer to a hidden psychological technology, one most people stumble into by accident rather than use on purpose. To understand why this distance matters so much, you have to look at what's actually happening when you're trapped in first-person distress. When you say, "I'm panicking," you are, in a very real sense, fused with the panic. There is no gap between the observer and the observed. The emotion and the self-experiencing it have collapsed into the same point. But something changes the instant you address yourself as you, or by your own name. A small, almost imperceptible distance opens up, a psychological gap between the self having the experience and the self observing it. And that gap, tiny as it sounds, is the exact space where regulation becomes possible. You cannot calm a storm from inside it. You can only calm it once some part of you has stepped slightly outside. This is what psychologists call self-distancing, and it may be one of the oldest tools the human mind has ever developed, even if we've only recently learned to name it. The Stoic philosophers, 2,000 years before the term chatter existed, practiced something remarkably similar. Marcus Aurelius, writing what were essentially private notes to himself, addressed himself constantly in the second person, reminding you to remember what is within your control, urging you not to be disturbed by things outside it. He wasn't performing philosophy for an audience. He was using exactly the distancing mechanism modern psychology would later measure in a lab, centuries before anyone could explain why it worked. But self-talk isn't only useful for managing panic in a single stressful moment. Its deeper function may be something closer to identity construction itself, the quiet, continuous narration by which a mind builds a coherent story out of a life that, moment to moment, has no story at all. This is where the psychologist Lev Vygotsky's research becomes essential. Vygotsky observed that children, while learning new skills, narrate themselves out loud constantly. Now I put the block here. Now this one goes on top. Not as a symptom of confusion, but as an actual mechanism of learning. He called it private speech, and he argued that it doesn't disappear as we grow older. It goes underground. What was once spoken aloud becomes internal monologue, the same guiding, narrating function, just quieter, just hidden beneath the surface of ordinary thought. Which means the voice in your head narrating your day isn't decoration. It's the same tool a child uses to learn to tie their shoes, still running, decades later, now applied to far more complicated tasks, regulating emotion, rehearsing difficult conversations, making sense of who you are. And this is where the topic reveals its true, hidden subject. Because talking to yourself was never really about the words. It's about the architecture of the self doing the talking, and whether that architecture is working for you or quietly working against you. Consider the version of self-talk most people don't notice because it happens too quietly to register as a conversation at all. The relentless internal commentary that runs beneath almost everything you do. You're so awkward. Why did you say that? Everyone probably noticed. This is still self-talk. It's simply self-talk that has calcified into something closer to a verdict than a conversation. One-directional, unquestioned, delivered with the unearned authority of fact. The tragedy is that most people never examine this voice with the same scrutiny they'd apply to an actual person saying those words to them. If a friend spoke to you the way your own inner monologue does after a mistake, you would very likely stop being friends with them. And yet this voice is granted a strange kind of immunity, simply because it originates from inside your own skull rather than outside it. This raises an uncomfortable but clarifying question. Whose voice is it, actually? Because the inner critic rarely emerges from nowhere. It is, more often than psychologists once assumed, an internalized echo, a parent's harsh correction, a teacher's dismissive comment, a culture's impossible standard, absorbed so early and so thoroughly that it eventually stops sounding like someone else's voice and starts sounding like your own thoughts. Sigmund Freud's original concept of the superego captured an early, if imperfect, version of this idea, an internalized authority figure, judging your every action, having taken up permanent residence inside your own mind. Modern psychology has refined it, but the core insight remains unsettlingly intact. The voice that feels most intimately you may, in some of its harshest moments, be the least authentically yours. It may simply be the accumulated residue of every voice that once had power over you, still speaking, long after those people have left the room. Which means the real work was never learning to silence your inner voice. Silence was never the goal, and may not even be possible for a mind built to narrate itself. The real work is learning to notice which voice is speaking at any given moment and choosing, deliberately, which one gets the floor. There's a particular kind of self-talk that seems to sit above both the panicked first-person spiral and the internalized harsh critic. Something closer to what the psychologist Kristen Neff calls self-compassionate self-talk. Not the inflated, hollow reassurance of, you're perfect, you can do anything, which the mind tends to reject as obviously false the moment real difficulty arrives. Something quieter and more durable, the tone you might use with a close friend who has just failed at something they cared about. Not denial of the failure. Acknowledgement of the pain, paired with the reminder that struggle is not evidence of unique inadequacy, but simply evidence of being human. Research on self-compassion consistently finds that this register of inner speech, unlike either harsh self-criticism or inflated self-praise, is the one most reliably associated with resilience, motivation, and the willingness to try again after failure. Not because it feels the best in the moment, because it is, among all the voices available to you, the only one that is simultaneously honest and survivable.